My name is Allison Pierok. I work at Globethics, which is an international NGO that focuses on responsible governance and ethical leadership. I work under our policy and engagement hub. Today, we will be discussing the stories of our futures with, obviously, as Lucy mentioned, an intergenerational panel. And this panel will be focusing on a conversation rather than a classic panel style. So I encourage all of our panelists to talk to each other and have a conversation. To start, I wanted to start with a little reflection before we get into our panelists. Many of us always grew up listening to our grandparents and our parents telling stories of the past. I walked up both ways to go to school. My parents in Ukraine, they would always say how they'd had to wait for hours to get bread. But for me, these stories showed resilience and learned about the community of my family, of my past. But also, what will I tell my children? Will I say, oh yes, I remember when the coffee was only 4 pounds. But for us, this goes beyond what we're looking for and what we need in the future. So how can stories of future generations affect us now, but how will the future generations remember us from what we tell them? So to start, I'd love to introduce quickly to our speakers. From our left, we have Stephen Hartman, who I think needs no introduction in this group as the Executive Director of UNESCO Bridges. And then we have Bethany Wiggin, from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a cultural and environmental historian from the Atlantic world and a public environmental humanist. Bethany leads the Climate Storytelling Initiative, which connects youth-led, community-driven stories to climate action. We then have Attala. Lucy, I don't even know how to say your last name. Okay, yeah, thank you. Al is currently studying fine art at Bristol and politics at Oxford. Al explores the intersection of art, world building, and the future. And then last but not least, we have Chris Pack. Chris is a scholar at Swansea University, and he focuses on how science fiction mediates our understanding of climate change, technology, and possible futures. I'd love to start with just an opening question for everyone, and then we can get into a bit more specifics. So I'd love all of you to, in 2 to 3 minutes, share your reflection on how storytelling, whether cultural, scientific, artistic, or speculative, helps us imagine and build better futures. Stephen, I'd love to start with you.
Okay, you hear me okay? Okay. I think storytelling is one of the deepest reservoirs that we have. Thinking back to how ancient wisdom was preserved and then transmitted across generations, across centuries, across cultures. It's a very, very powerful tool. And I think storytelling is something that people connect with without necessarily having to get too theoretical about it. People live stories all the time. They interact with stories all the time. They help make sense of their lives, of their world, of the past, the present, and the future. And stories can enable everyone to have a degree of agency in their lives and in their world that I think it's hard to think of what else. There are other things that give agency, other forms of artistic and cultural expression. But stories, I think we're so sort of accustomed to the functioning of stories, how the logic through which stories are built and how they convey meaning and values, that I think it's an accessible form of thinking not only about the challenges we face in the present, but how we might come to terms with our concerns and anxieties for the future. So I guess that's the broad way of sort of opening up, for me, what I think is the incredible power that stories hold and the incredible potential that they have for future building and world building.
Wow, thank you so much. Borada Diolch am Fina Huasu I Gimru. It's a very bad pronunciation. Thank you, Google Translate. That was good morning, and thank you for welcoming me to Wales. I would like to begin with a story, not from Wales, but from my home in the US state of Maine, which is in the northeastern coast on the Canadian border, bordered also by a lot of water. I spend my summers there, usually to try to write and think. I'm a university professor, and I like to do my writing mostly in the summertime. And during pandemic, I went to my home there. I had, of course, been there the year before, and I was walking around, and I noticed that across the shorelines, about half of our spruce trees were not green, but gray. And I was really sort of puzzled. And the previous year, these trees had been completely fine. And of course, what I realized was that saltwater intrusion had killed our trees. It had been 1 year, and I was shocked, really shocked. And the more I thought about this experience of my own bewilderment that climate was impacting my home, I thought, I teach about climate impacts all the time. Why am I so surprised? And what I realized is that I was surprised because it was happening to me. And that insight really began a project which I call a labor of love, but has also been a co-labor of love with many students, but also with many elders. Children from the 8th grade all the way up through seniors and elders in retirement centers who are working together to share our climate stories. They're not all stories of loss. Some are stories of connection and resilience. But what we do is try to create learning communities to tell stories of climate and to remind us that we are experiencing climate. It is global climate change, which means that there are millions of stories of climate impacts. Not only scientists need to talk about climate, but actually everyday experiences need to be shared in everyday spaces. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hello. No? Hello. Okay.
That's because it was his mother.
Yeah, true.
Everyone could hear you, don't worry.
Okay. Yeah, I think to an extent, stories are everything. I think you're all here because on some level you told yourself a story that you want to do something about, or at least you're interested in the state the world is in right now. I struggle to think of something that is not, I struggle to think of a human motivation that is in some way not motivated by a story that we tell ourselves, so like an ideology or politics. In the case of world building, I think about interactive stories, so picking up on something Stephen said about the link between stories and agency. A lot of the inspiration for my work, which I won't go into too much, has been video games and like interactive fiction like Dungeons and Dragons, which allows you to have some kind of agency over a world that is fictional, but is obviously very much based on real world struggles. So there's that fictional aspect, but there is also very much the extent to which stories allow us to think about the very real problems we have and allow us to think about what agency we have over them. And you know, everything's good for theory, but the idea of actually doing something can be quite powerful. And I actually think that's the explanation for most human actions. So anyway, that's me.
Yes. Okay, I get to go last. So picking up on a couple of different things, I think how we use stories, how we position them in relation to ourselves is the kind of key thing that we need to think about. And stories can function as a way to express particularly experiences, as a way to position ourselves in experiences that we don't have access to. But this function of stories as part of an element of community building, and an element of creating our futures, I think is really important. We should be arguing about the stories that we've read, and we should propose new stories that revise some of the things that older stories perhaps get wrong from our perspectives or don't really adequately address. So one of the things I like to do when thinking about stories is how we as readers, a community of readers, might reflect on specific stories and their relevance to our particular position, and then how we might rewrite those stories to kind of better fit the futures that we want to create, how we might then communicate those rewritten versions of those stories much more broadly in order to kind of galvanize a broader community that goes beyond that immediate group of people using that story for a particular purpose. So stories and storytelling, I think, go hand in hand. We have the stories themselves, and then we have the actual activity, the cognitive and social activity of telling stories to one another and arguing about those stories as a way of, expressing the kinds of things that we want to see in the future. So I think that's a really important thing to kind of bear in mind when we are thinking about what stories actually are.
Great, thank you so much. I think one of the great things about this, is we all agree that stories have a massive impact in the work that we do, but we all work in different fields. But the fact that in the end of the day, all of the stories converge into one shared future. Since you ended with you, Chris, we'll start with you. How can science fiction and your particular work help us think differently about climate technology and society? And I'd love for the rest of the panel to jump in after this within your own experiences from this question.
So I am a science fiction scholar, and I've been thinking and working with science fiction for my whole life. And one of the key things to remember about science fiction is that it isn't any one thing. It's many different things. It's many different stories. Perhaps one of the things about science fiction is that over the course of the 100+ years that it's been written, filmed, imagined, a language has developed around it. Sometimes multiple overlapping languages. And these languages can allow us to kind of project our contemporary anxieties, anticipations, hopes, and fears into new contexts that we can then map onto our contemporary moment in order to kind of work through some issues from a kind of slanted viewpoint. And so in a sense, it's a kind of way of modeling different visions of possible futures that might emerge given specific contexts in the present. And then we can kind of argue about those specific contexts, how they're actually constituted, what we actually might need to do to kind of get to our desired model. But the point of that is not to kind of enact those visions. The point of that is to kind of develop a kind of flexibility about thinking about scenario building and how a particular technology or a particular social event or formation or a particular event might impact upon our contemporaneity right now. And so we can use these kinds of science fictions and the language that's kind of developed around them as a kind of scenario building and experimentation with remaking our present by making a future. And so science fiction is always connected to the present. It's not just about the future. The future is always about how we view those futures from our present moment. And then we can kind of proliferate these possible visions in order to kind of triangulate on the kinds of things that we want to work towards. I think that was 3 minutes, right?
Wonderful. Would anyone like to rebut that? Rebut or add.
Oh, add, please. When you say multiple languages, do you mean the ways in which people in those settings speak or the ways people speak about them? And can you give examples? Okay,
so I actually mean the ways in which these stories are told and framed. So some easy examples might be the 1950s, 60s B-movie, the science fiction B-movie. It has a particular set of plot devices, ways in which that story might develop. And, science fiction fans and science fiction story writers have noticed how that has developed in the 50s and has responded over the decades by refiguring a lot of those tropes and kind of assumptions built into those stories. And you can see this in the area of climate fictions, fictions about artificial intelligence, fictions about physics, so on and so forth. These are kinds of ideas that are closely associated with one another over time as many of these stories are being told and retold. And sometimes these kinds of associations feel natural, but they can be broken apart because they've only been associated through tradition and storytelling. We can tell new stories that refigure some of these ideas, some of the terms that are used, so on and so forth. So I'm specifically talking about the kinds of concepts, metaphors, plot devices, and forms, story forms that science fiction uses throughout its history.
Thanks.
Since we're talking about, obviously, storytelling in science fiction
Can
and
I
how
actually jump in, Allison?
Please.
Yeah, I really appreciated that question, Al, about the different languages and your answer to Chris. And I wanted to connect with something, Chris, that you were saying also about the need to retell or maybe reinvent some stories. I think that I'm trained as a humanist, and I know some people in this room are also. And one of the things that I think we need to challenge ourselves to do is to actually rethink our story of what it means to be a humanist. Because what it means to be a humanist is actually not usually about telling stories. It is sometimes, but it's actually about usually doing the work of critique. And I was raised, I went to graduate school in the 90s and early aughts, and thought, the story I told myself was that critique was actually really revolutionary and it was going to change the world. And I think there's some truth to that. But actually, what I have really realized is that in many ways, the work of critique published in very small, elite, scholarly journals behind a paywall is actually business as usual. And it was a really bad story. I was telling myself that publishing in academic forums for other humanists was really somehow going to make for a more sustainable world. So instead, I started to challenge myself to think with my students about the kinds of stories that they needed, that they wanted. And then I want to connect to your science fiction question too, which is one of the things that I think we need to say here is that not all stories are good, right? I mean, I think there is sometimes an often unspoken assumption that storytelling is so great. Well, the Trump administration are great storytellers. They're not great stories for climate health and the lives of multi-species communities. Great stories for the fossil fuel industry. Science fiction stories are often also stories that are overloaded with a kind of scientific techno-imaginary. And I think in some ways that can be quite disabling for a lot of people. It privileges a certain kind of expertise for certain. And working with students this past year, while I was at Princeton, we actually challenged ourselves to think of a new kind of science fiction. And we were really inspired by the Icelandic writer Andri Snær Magnusson, who in Icelandic talks about pancake science fiction. That concept didn't translate very well into English, so we started to call it kitchen table science fiction, in which students helped us to develop workshops that were set in the future, but set around a kitchen table, where they were eating lovely foods with their future grandchildren, much as they had with their own grandparents. So I just want us to be careful when we think about storytelling, and that storytelling can do a lot of things, and it's not necessarily just good.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, and I might like to hop on the end of that by saying as well, I agree completely. There's a lot of very dangerous stories that we're exposed to all the time and have been, most of us, all of our lives. And sometimes these stories can have greater influence than at others. I think we see, stories that that stigmatize others and those from outside of a sort of cultural environment, a cultural system, and try to sort of scapegoat these people. We see this rife throughout the world, and right now it seems to be rampant. And so we can think of examples of this kind of application of stories towards nativist agendas that are very dangerous. And I think it's worth sort of stepping back from that and also thinking about, in a time of more and more ChatGPT and the sort of AI-enabled popular exposure to stories, we have maybe a greater need than ever to be developing critical sort of stances and positions in relation to, and developing critical literacies around storytelling. So I'll give you one example, and this is a kind of a well-known example, so some of you may have heard of this before. But for a long time, there was a story that circulated that the shortest story ever told was attributed to Ernest Hemingway. And that story was the words on a sign, 6 words on a sign. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Now, of course, that has an immediate, to most people, kind of, sort of, gives you a sort of a pang. There's a power to that, really, the economy of that 6-word micro story. Now, there's another story around it, though. The attribution to Hemingway. Why it was attributed to Hemingway, for what reasons, it's hard to say, but it's a misattribution. We know that variations on this 6-word story can be traced back at least until the 1880s, sometime, long before Hemingway was even born, and maybe even earlier, which I think raises, does that, though, make that story any less powerful? Not necessarily, but the cognizance that that powerful micro-story is being used and being attributed to someone who's a valorized, at the time, maybe a valorized figure, raises all sorts of questions about why did whoever is promoting the story want us to think that Hemingway had written it? What was sort of behind that? And I think this, you begin pulling at that thread, and it more and more begins to sort of unravel about the ways in which stories are used. So history has often been discussed in terms of the usable past. History writing is storytelling in its own right. And so the usable past, usable stories, I think we have to, it's really important for us to begin thinking about in what ways do we need to be more guarded or more on our guard about the ways in which stories act upon us. And how can we actually adopt a critical attitude towards that that realizes the power and how we may be getting manipulated and how these manipulations may be occurring at numerous scales in our society. So, and I think that's important now more than ever, because I think we're being exposed to stories that have not necessarily any single human agent behind them, but on a completely different scale, and we need to really begin to sort of prepare ourselves for how we allow those stories to act on us and how we allow ourselves to use or not use those stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that essentially what we're all involved here on this panel right now is telling stories about storytelling itself. And this is a story that we're actually developing between us, plugging into other stories that are circulating out there. And so while critique is important, we have to be aware that of the fact that we're engaging in these storytelling practices, but I think a fluency with the fact that we are speaking in that kind of language and just being really aware that we're actually trying to craft this kind of vision of these different modes of storytelling is really important. One of the things I like to do with my students, for example, who, when I talk about politics or in science fiction, is to prepare them for an analysis of some science fiction, and then I present some political manifestos to them, for example. So they're not science fictions in themselves, they're actual political discourses. And I say to them, how would we read these if we read these as science fictions? And one of the fascinating things is they seem a little more comfortable with engaging with them at that level than they would if it was framed in another way. So how we frame those stories in relation to people as well as, and the interpretative practice is really key, I think.
We talk about framing, that's a great segue, and we talk about the kind of stories that we need to be telling or how we want to shape it. But I'd love to ask Bethany, what kind of questions do you encourage your students and the youth that you engage with to ask their elders, their community members? What kind of questions should we as a society be asking those, and what benefits would we gain by having these answered?
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. And I just want to say, Al, please jump in here, okay? So.
Okay, I may.
Good, yeah. So one of the things I think is really important is that, yes, the students learn from their elders, but actually the elders also learn from the students. The kinds of questions that they ask one another, I mean, one of the things that it's very hard for a college student or a high school student to know is they have no baseline for what maybe their neighborhood was. They really can't experience climate within their lifetime. They can experience weather. So by asking elders or people who have lived in their community for a longer period of time, hey, what was this place like? What were the important family rituals that you had? And then thinking about how those rituals and habits in that shared environment have been actually quite radically shifted because of hotter summers, for example, or lack of ice in the winter, or extreme rainfall. I'm citing examples now from my home adopted city of Philadelphia, but that's been a really important learning thing for the students from the elders. The elders, in listening to younger students, younger learners' stories about their imagined futures, I think, have actually had to understand that for the youth participants in our project, there is no business as usual that's possible. They don't see it as possible, and they don't, I'm not sure. That's you. They also don't want to be educated into business as usual. And I think what that has done, at least for me and for colleagues as well, is to really invite us, and in some cases force us, to rethink how we teach, who we teach with, and to think less about assigning grades, and more about inviting students to share with us what success looks like for them. And I have to say one more thing, because my students would be so disappointed in me if I didn't, which is that this year they made the first climate story magazine, Campus Climate Story magazine, issue 1 on the bottom, as you see, and they asked me to bring this here to share with you because they would like to invite you to use the workshops that they developed to use these tools to create your campus's or other communities' climate magazine. So I brought some of these that Princeton generously printed, and would love to unburden my suitcase and give them to you.
I'm sure you will come back with an empty suitcase or having lots of things from Wales, so to replace them. To include you and have your insights, because you work also in the fine art world and studying fine art, as well as the mix between politics, how do you combine the world building in art and storytelling, and how do you plan and see this shaping the future differently?
Okay, so a common response to that question that you get from world builders is that through some kind of like speculative or imaginative, collaborative fiction, we can imagine a new future for ourselves. And the implication of that is that we need to view the future a little bit like a story we can tell. And I agree with that, but I think we can take it a little bit further. So if a story can direct the world, I think it begs the question, what stories have already directed the world? And if we view them as stories, I guess ideologies or movements, if you want to call them, we can understand them a lot easier and we can dissect them in that way as well. So to explain what I mean, if you take what I would say is the current, like, quote unquote, ruling ideology that's neoliberalism, we can see that it saw as a story the end goal for itself. The ending was that there was a villain, another economic system to be quote unquote defeated, which was communism. And when in its eyes communism fell, it saw that as the ending. So I think the basic outcome of that is that we have an ideological and economic system that is basically ruling most of the world, that doesn't think it has anywhere more to go because it's already post-credits. So when the story it's told itself is kind of over, and I think the very practical outcome of that is that we have a generation of at least high-level politicians who really only want to keep the present running as it is. I think I don't know if it's personal motivation, but at least what they actually do is very much in line with sort of ideologically committed to the same, and that is something that is literally physically unable to deal with something that requires a minor change, or on a greater level, something like global warming, which requires such a fundamental change that it's not even in the ballpark of what can be discussed. And I think it's easy to see that when we view these ideologies as stories. If you need another example of what I mean, you can see the very stereotypical ending of a story, like the idea of happily ever after, implies that the positive state, or whatever state, at the ending of a story continues indefinitely. So what we've told ourselves, and I realize that this type of story is not universal, there are definitely indigenous stories which are told differently, but what a large swath of the world has told itself is that a story ends and its ending state should continue forever. You see what I mean? I think it's arguable that humans have made societies to try and kind of create that kind of safety. We even call them states, as in states of being, like a continual way that something should be. So I guess I've only got to that conclusion from thinking of the world through a world-building lens, which makes you not necessarily think about politics and think about storytelling on a wider scale, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, I do think there's kind of stasis built into a lot of storytelling. And one of the things about these kinds of speculative modes, I actually personally don't use science fiction. I use the term science fiction to talk to people, but I think of these kinds of fictions as speculative fictions of a variety of types. There are some of these kinds of stories are actually premised on an openness that there will be change and difference at the ending of the story. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about these speculative genres, speculative stories. Not all of them, because there are a lot of these stories that do still trade on this kind of stasis, like achieving an end goal that must be perpetuated. But there are a lot of stories in the speculative kind of mode that are premised on a continual change, and that the kind of world that you see as a reader will change. To some degree, that kind of buys into market logics of buying the next episode of the series, so on and so forth. But I think there is a kind of important lesson there about the continual need to reevaluate your position in a particular context.
Thank you so much. Stephen, I'd love to hear your insight on this as well. You and I both work a bit more in the intersection of academia and policy. So how can we blend this narrative storytelling within policy? Our previous presenters also touched upon this topic, and I'd love to hear your insights on how can we best integrate intergenerational storytelling into policy practices in a practical manner, rather than have it be as an addition. Oftentimes, many of us have been to other conferences as panels, and we see having an art exhibition on the side, or having a storytelling or a youth section in the corner. How do we completely merge these, rather than just having them as a side attraction?
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm going to lean on an example from last year. When we were working together, Globethics was working with Bridges, was working with the Club of Rome and the Future Generations Commissioner, ASU. We were all coming together in a series of sort of workshops and consultations with different groups, many of them youth groups, and certainly cross-cultural communities. And we had one workshop at the Learning Planet Institute. My colleague Joni mentioned the Learning Planet Institute earlier. We had a workshop at the Learning Planet Institute, and another ASU colleague, Iveta Silova, was there with me, and we did this exercise with those assembled where it was a kind of a futures backcasting. So a speculative futures backcasting whereby we asked people, first of all, to think, okay, think about a place you love very much. It doesn't have to be where you come from, it doesn't have to be home, but it's something that has a special meaning to you. Now, think about that place in 2050. And without loading it one way or the other, we wanted people to be able to express how they imagined that place would be, could be, how they feared it might be, or what have you. And so they did that, and we got a remarkable, so that through this speculative act, we got this remarkable range of responses, some of them very hopeful, some of them very fearful, some of them almost deeply sad. And so that was a staging point then for a second part of the exercise, which was now go back and maybe in a small group, identify a few of these scenarios that have been brought up. And imagine using stories methodologically to build the arc between where we are at the present and how it got that way in 2050. And this opened up a really productive dialogue that I think had a lot of policy relevance, even if it wasn't necessarily going to be yielding specific policies. But it did open up a lot of the underlying concerns and anxieties, as well as possibilities for those people who saw that arc being potentially a constructive process. So if the scenario in 2050 was, we finally got this in hand, we managed to solve most of the major issues around water usage, around pollution, around other sustainability-oriented, let's say, goals. What made that possible? What were the landmark steps along the way? And so they worked on building that story, which then was then potentially a powerful way of breaking that distance between the inaccessible future that we either fear or hope for and where we are at the present, because that then implied potential steps. Now, it went the other way, too. For those people who had sad stories at the end, it also sort of mapped out a trajectory for if this continues and that happens after that, we may end up here. And so the implication being, well, we need to avoid that. We need to find another route. So I see storytelling as a policy-relevant supportive exercise.
I want to say that I think one of the most important things that we can do is to actually kind of do what I've come to think of as unblack boxing policy. Like, policy is a process, and it doesn't exist somewhere out there separate from what we do. So I'll tell you two specific ways that in the climate storytelling project that we've tried to unblack box policy and invite students and city people living in our city to participate in policy. Two specific ways. 2 years ago, I worked with a group of high school teachers and college students, and I trained these high school teachers to use the workshops that we had developed together. Those teachers took these workshops to their high school classrooms ranging from chemistry to art classes, and together their assignment was basically to surface their school's climate stories. So the students became reporters in their schools, and we partnered with our city's largest public media outlet. So in Philadelphia, it's a syndicate of national public radio, so WHYY, with a listening audience of 970,000 people. So WHYY was delighted to partner with us. It was really because we didn't need any money from them, and we provided content, which they wanted. So we said, okay, great, the stories that you're gonna hear from us are gonna come from the teachers and their students, And the media channel amplified these students' stories so that over 1 million people heard them. But when we held a citywide climate storytelling festival, thanks to our media partner who hosted us, they also invited the mayor's office. So we had both kind of informal policy outcomes as well as very formal policy outcomes. And then the other policy relevant dimension I want to share with you from this climate storytelling project is simply last year, I worked with some Penn College students who had developed a workshop around creating short personal narratives via video, so it was really a TikTok and Instagram project. And they were really quite remarkable. And the students said, you know, what we really want to do is train other college students to do this. So we trained, by application, we had many applicants who came to us, and we were able to offer them small stipends. They came from 12 colleges and universities across the continent, from British Columbia in Canada to Puerto Rico. And they became reporters in their campus communities. What we then asked them to do and what we trained them to do was actually to write op-ed pieces. So I developed a workshop about how to write an op-ed piece for your city's newspaper that reports on your community's climate stories and then says what you want to have happen out of these stories. And I will tell you that we trained 12 students to write op-eds. We taught them how to pitch, and fully 1/3 of their op-ed were picked up by their community's newspapers. Now, 33% doesn't sound like a good grade, but in terms of the pickup rate for an op-ed, it's actually extremely high. So it's another kind of concrete way, I think, that we can enter the policy or sort of para-policy arena.
Great, thank you so much, guys. I feel like I need to go reflect on my own work and come back with better questions to answer, because for me, this is so inspiring for my own work that we do when we're talking about storytelling and engaging with students and people. How can we better leverage this for reinventing responsible governance, for being better leaders in our own communities? To close the panel, I would love for us to play a small game. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start with Chris, and we're gonna build a story. So I'm gonna start with the first sentence, and you will need to finish it, and then you will need to say, and then, and it will then go to Al, and then so on. So, to begin, in our story of the future, we must
find ways to speak to one another, and then
include imagination and the arts, and then
And then she felt so much pressure, she didn't know what to say.
so same. Just say anything.
And then to also provide space for joy, hope, pleasure.
And then relearn the art of humility.
Oh, wow.
I think that's a beautiful story for
Somber
the
ending.
future. Thank you, everyone, for your time.